We're lucky to have Donna and Christy here with us today. Donna Smith is the Director of Training at Easter Seals Project Action. She has over 35 years of experience in disability advocacy, mostly working as a training and technical assistance specialist. She has focused on transportation-related issues since 2002. Her areas of expertise include community approaches to improving accessible transportation, coalition building, ADA rights and responsibilities, travel training, the increasing role of technology in transportation access, and more. Donna understands firsthand the essential role of accessible, affordable transportation for people with disabilities, and it is both her job and her passion to help find solutions to transportation needs. Christy McLaughlin is a training and technical assistance specialist at Easter Seals Project Action. She is an experienced trainer and has extensive knowledge of the ADA transportation provisions, best practices in customer service, paratransit eligibility and operations, coordination planning, and travel training. Previous transit positions include General Manager of a dial-a-ride service, Manager of a paratransit system, and Scheduling Clerk. Both have ADA Coordinator certifications from the Great Plains ADA Center and the University of Missouri. So with that, I would like to welcome Donna and Christy, and we'll now turn the presentation over to them. So we'll just be switching screens, so bear with us one moment. Donna and Christy?
Thank you so much. We are really pleased to be here. This is Christy. I thank the National RTAP for inviting us to do this presentation. Donna and I are going to be talking about some of the most frequently received questions that we get. And so we're going to do a little back and forth, and I'll be reading questions and she'll be answering and vice versa. But again, thank you for participating today, and we are super excited to be here. So I believe in just a second you'll be able to see our PowerPoint. There we go. Hopefully that's working properly. So again, we're happy to be here. We're going to go through some frequently received questions. Please do, though, make note of any questions that you have and post those in the chat section. We're happy to answer those once we're finished with the presentation. So we're just going to dive right in. The first question I will present to Donna, and she'll answer. And that question is, can an agency require passengers to have brakes and footrests on their wheelchairs?
And hello everyone, this is Donna. I'm also very happy to be here today, and I'm going to start with answering this question. So the short answer is no. I'm about to give the specific definition in the ADA regulations from the Department of Transportation for mobility devices, and you'll see that it doesn't include anything about brakes or footrests. So it is a mobility aid belonging to any class of 3 or more wheeled devices, usable indoors, designed or modified for and used by individuals with disabilities, individuals with mobility impairments, whether operated manually or powered. So you can see that there's nothing in there about brakes or footrests. So you can't require a person to have them or use them. So if a person has brakes but they do not want to, for whatever reason, set that brake, you can't require them to do it.
All right, great. So let's move to the next question, which will also be answered by Donna. The question is, if an operator is afraid of a service animal or allergic to that type of animal, can the driver deny service to the passenger?
Well, the answer to that one is no as well. Service animals are an extension of the traveler. So you're serving the customer and the service animal that they choose to use. And it's a critical part of any, whatever that service is, whatever task that animal performs for the individual is a critical part of their life and their independence. And so just as you wouldn't deny a ride to a passenger who maybe had their elbow bumped when they were putting on their cologne that morning so that it was a very strong scent, even if the operator was allergic to really strong scents, you can't deny a trip to a person who's using a wheelchair for that reason. The issue of fear is a little bit different, although you still cannot, again, deny the trip if an operator is afraid of animals. And it's the sort of thing that's similar to the direct threat rationale, so you can't deny service to a person just because you think they might be a direct threat. It has to actually happen. Same thing with the service animal. You can't deny service because you don't really like or trust big dogs, for instance. You just have to provide the trip, and then if a threat should occur, then that's addressed separately.
All right, great. Our next question is, a passenger is waiting at the stop with a dog, and the operator is unsure whether it is a service animal. What can be done at the stop to determine service animal status?
So there are two questions that you can ask about a service animal. One is that a service animal? And the second question is, what task does it perform for you? So you can ask those two questions. I know that there's a lot of concern out there about an abuse of this policy with regard to people bringing their pets on board with them and saying they're a service animal. But usually when you get to that second question about what task does it perform, if the answer is just something like, oh, I feel better if I have my dog with me, then that's not a service animal. That's a pet or a comfort animal. But if they can tell you real specific tasks that it performs for them, then you need to accept the whatever the response the passenger has given you and allowed them on the bus. You can't ask for any kind of proof of service animal status. There's no certification process for service animals. You can't ask them to demonstrate how the animal works for you, and you cannot ask for a doctor's note or proof that that person has a disability. In fact, you shouldn't ask anything about the disability at all. You should just keep it to, is it a service animal and what task does it perform? And if the person can answer those two questions, then they and their animal get to ride.
Great. The next question. Sometimes a service animal will make a mess on the bus. Can the transit agency charge the passenger for the cost of cleaning?
Well, this certainly happens. Accidents happen with any of us. So you want to go back to your policy about what do you do if a customer makes a mess on your bus. So let's say you have a no drinking policy on the bus, but if a person's bringing their lunch into work, they may have something with a lid on it, and let's say it drops and it spills and it makes a big mess in your bus. You just apply that same policy to if a service animal makes a mess. So we're kind of going back to what we said earlier about the animal being an extension of the person. So if that animal makes a mess and it's your policy to charge a person for having the bus cleaned after that mess is there, then you can apply the same policy to people with service animals. If you do not have that policy, you can't all of a sudden say, well, now it's a service animal and we're going to make this happen. All right, so I'm going to ask some questions of Christy now. We're going to switch gears here just a little bit. So like we were saying earlier, if you do have additional questions about service animals that we haven't covered, drop them in the chat field, and then Liz and Jess will ask us those questions later. All right, Christy, this one's for you. Is an ADA refresher training required yearly to keep bus operators proficient?
Well, the short answer to that question is no. There is some language in the ADA that does require that operators be trained to proficiency, but it does not make a specific requirement that proficiency includes an annual type of refresher training. Having said that, though, having training when they're first hired, a lot of drivers may forget certain parts of the requirements as the years go on, and so having some type of way, and often that is an annual refresher training for drivers to keep their skills up and to be up to date on any guidance and or changes that the ADA may have experienced is a great way to continue to ensure that your drivers are trained to proficiency. So there is a requirement under the ADA for training to proficiency. It doesn't have to be annual, but they do need to continue to be proficient in what the ADA requires. And if you're interested in finding that, that is in the regulations in subpart G of section 37.173.
All right. So can you require, or can you have a policy to require passengers with disabilities to be restrained with seatbelts?
This is kind of maybe a little bit of a two-part answer, but ultimately the answer is yes. You can require people that use wheelchairs to be using seatbelts if you are requiring everyone to use a seatbelt. So this especially comes into play in rural transportation. You know, if you're thinking urban transportation, it's not usually the case that there are seatbelts available for everyone on the vehicle. But in rural transportation, that's quite different. It is often the case that there is a seatbelt available for everyone on the vehicle. And if it is the agency's policy that everyone use a seatbelt in order for the bus to go into motion, then it is acceptable at that point to require that people with disabilities in wheelchairs also use a seatbelt, including the lap belt and the shoulder restraint if that's required of everyone. Really, it comes down to the discrimination part of the ADA that says you can't require a person with a disability to do something that you're not requiring a person without a disability to do. So yes, as long as everyone's required to wear seatbelts.
So following along with that, can you have a mandatory mobility device securement policy?
The answer to that is also yes. The ADA does give transit agencies the ability to set a policy with regard to wheelchair securement, and so what that states, let me see, it is in section 37.165, and what that states is that the agency can either require all wheelchairs to be secured to the vehicle, or they can provide securement upon request of the passenger. So it has to be available if the passenger wants it, but they also can take that extra step and require securement of all wheelchairs before the bus moves into motion. Having said that, though, there is an extra piece of information provided in the regulations that says that it's not acceptable to deny transportation to a person using a wheelchair when the wheelchair cannot be secured or restrained to the operator's satisfaction. So if you have, for example, a 4-point securement, that's what you do typically for all of your wheelchairs, and you're not quite satisfied that the type of wheelchair that you're securing is secured properly, that's not a reason to deny service to the person using the wheelchair. You can require that they allow you to try to secure it, but you shouldn't at that point deny them service.
All right, well, just to be very thorough then, can you have a mandatory seat transfer policy?
So what this means is that you're requiring a person to transfer from their wheelchair to a seat on the bus. And this can come in handy considering that there are generally 2 wheelchair securement locations on a vehicle, and sometimes it would be helpful if a person, especially using a manual wheelchair, would transfer to a seat on the bus so that the manual wheelchair can be stowed and you can still accommodate 2 additional people using wheelchairs or other mobility devices. So ultimately, though, the answer is no. It can't be required that a person transfer, and this is in 37.165, and what it states is that the entity may recommend that a person transfer. You can recommend and or ask for it to happen, but you can't require the transfer.
All right, so one more question here, at least for right now, about lifts and securement. So are lifts and securement areas identified as part of the required pre-trip inspection?
Absolutely. Every transit agency is going to have a slightly different policy on how they conduct pre-trip inspections. They possibly have different forms that they fill out or procedures that they go through for their pre-trip inspection, but every pre-trip inspection should include the testing of the accessibility equipment on the vehicle. Including the lift, the ramp, if there's an automated stop system for fixed route, then those things should be tested prior to the vehicle leaving the station.
Okay, so then are bus operators required to refuse a bus during a pre-trip test if the lift fails to operate?
This is a great question. We get this one quite a bit. The answer is yes. If an accessibility feature on the vehicle is not working and you discover that in a pre-trip inspection, the vehicle should not leave the bus station unless, however, there is an unless there's not another vehicle that can be put into its place. So if there's no spare vehicle and that vehicle really has to go out in order to provide the service that you need to provide, then you go ahead and send it out. And but you do have a limit of days in which that vehicle can be in service, and it's a maximum of 3 days for providers operating in areas over 50,000, and it's 5 days for providers operating in an area of 50,000 population or less. And so you have 3 or 5 days depending on your service area, and at that point the vehicle does need to be removed from service and repaired before it's returned to service. All right, so now I'm going to switch things back up and let Donna answer a few more questions. The next question is, are bus operators and dispatchers required to receive ADA regulatory updates in writing annually?
Well, there's not a requirement that this be done annually. However, if there is a regulatory update that's put into place, agencies then are required to abide by that regulation. So you have to put that regulation into practice. And so, of course, it just makes sense then that the personnel who's going to be impacted by this particular change in regulation, they need to be notified about it. Regulatory updates to the ADA occur infrequently. So providing your agency staff with an annual copy of what the regulations are, might be a little bit over the top. However, as we talked about earlier, when Christy was talking about training to proficiency, there's certainly nothing wrong with doing some kind of annual in-service training on ADA, and what we really recommend is that you kind of take what your hot spot areas are. So if you've been getting some complaints or if you've been doing some monitoring of your system and notice some things that are happening, or maybe operators or your call center staff are asking specific things, you may want to do some kind of in-service update training around those particular ADA issues. But there's no requirement that you do some kind of annual reading or distribution of regulations if they haven't changed.
Okay, great. So now we're going to take, or Donna's going to answer a few questions on stop announcements, and this obviously would be related to any provider that has fixed route service. And so the first question on stop announcements is, are all major intersections and bus stops required to be called out to passengers?
And the answer is that they are. Remember, we're talking about fixed route buses here, and there are certain types of stops which are required under the ADA to be announced. And I'm going to run through what those are. So the first one is at any transfer point. So that could be a transfer to another bus or transfer to a train or a ferry, any stop at which a person can get off and transfer to another public transportation route. That stop needs to be called. And then the next one is the major intersections and destination points, which is what the question was about. This is the way the ADA requires it. However, it's to be determined by local entities. So you get to determine in your community, within the area that your buses travel, what are the major destination points, what are the major intersections and the destination points. So if there's a a baseball stadium that your bus goes to, that would be a major destination point. And so you get to set what those are, and then once they're set, those are required to be called out. Another reason to call out stops, or requirement for calling out stops, is at sufficient intervals so that passengers with visual impairments can stay oriented. And I always say this is getting a little squishy here because, again, it's not specific. It doesn't say call out every third stop or call out a stop in every 15 minutes. So it doesn't give you any guidelines to go by here. But what you may want to do is work with your ridership or if you have an advisory board and try to get some feedback about how many stops is enough. So you know you're calling out those major destination points. You know you're calling out transfer points. And then let's say there's 12 stops between the required destination points. You might decide we're going to call it every 3, or we're going to call out every single one of them, whatever the case may be. I will say that most of the automated enunciator systems are just set to go ahead and call out all of the stops. Now, that's not always the case, but it's frequently the case. But again, it's up to you to set that policy. When there's more than one route that serves a stop or station, you need to have an identifier called. So when the bus doors open and there may be 2 or more buses that stop at that stop going in different directions or different routes, you need to announce the bus. So when the doors open, if it's the 16Y bus, then the operator needs to announce out to the stop, this is 16Y going to whatever the destination point is. And then finally, at the request of a person with a disability. And of course, since you're not, in the business of asking people whether they have a disability or not, really this is anytime anybody asks you for a particular stop, you would just call it out. So for instance, when I'm going home every day, my bus stop is not, it doesn't meet any of these previous criteria. So if we didn't have the automated announcement systems, I would get on and ask the operator to tell me when I got to Zebros, and they would need to call out that stop. We're going to move to the next slide because we want to talk about how this applies to demand response and deviated fixed route. These drivers are not required to call out the stops. However, it's kind of common sense to think that if it's beneficial on a fixed route system, it might also be beneficial on a flexible route or a deviated fixed route system as well. But it's a matter of policy. It's not required by the ADA. It is a matter of policy. And really what you kind of want to think about here is what's going to make people with disabilities more comfortable riding your vehicles, taking those trips. And so you may want to consider calling out the stops as a matter of policy.
Great. So what about if there are not any people with disabilities on board? Are call stops or are stop announcements required at that point?
They are, because you don't really know if there's a passenger on your bus who needs that kind of announcements to be made. So, commonly we think about stop announcements, verbal stop announcements being of benefit to people with visual impairments, and that's absolutely true. But it might also be beneficial to any of a number of other people with hidden disabilities. It's also fairly useful to people who are not familiar with your area. So visitors or tourists in the area could probably benefit from that. Any of a number of people on your bus could benefit from the announcements. And so since you don't really know if there's a person on the vehicle who needs it, you're required just to call them regardless. And one of the things to think about is that there are a number of people who have low vision. So they do have a vision disability. They have some usable sight, but they don't generally carry anything with them that helps you identify them as having low vision. So they don't necessarily have a cane in their hand. They don't necessarily use service animals, whatever kinds of clues that you normally go by to consider whether a person has a visual impairment. And they may be on your bus and you don't even know it. So the stops are required at all times, anytime the bus is in motion.
Right, great. So in a lot of cases, and certainly this is becoming even more prevalent as time goes on, but there are PA systems available, as you mentioned, that call the stops automatically. But if the PA system is not operable, can the bus operator vocally call out the stops and still be compliant with the ADA?
Yes, really, as long as the stops are being announced, that's really all that's required. So if the machinery isn't working, which certainly happens, then you need to have your operators make those calls. Okay, my question. I didn't realize that. All right, here we go, Christy. Is it a violation of the ADA for a bus operator to report that a lift is inoperable to a passenger with a disability when it is not in fact broken?
Yes, actually that is a violation of the ADA. The ADA is really in place to ensure that people with disabilities are getting equal access to transportation. And if an operator is claiming that an accessibility feature that would enable a person with a disability to ride independently is not operable when in fact it is, that's in essence just denying a ride to a person with a disability, which is exactly what the ADA is in place to prevent. So, so the answer is yes. If an operator tells a person with a disability that a lift or any other accessibility feature on the bus isn't working when it is, and that keeps them from riding, then that would be considered a denial of service under the ADA.
So then is a pass-by of a passenger with a disability, is that a violation of the ADA? And then what if the vehicle does in fact have an inoperable lift and you just pass by the passenger with a disability at the stop? Is that a violation?
Well, I'll take the first part of the question first. Is a pass-by a violation? And that is if the driver simply doesn't stop for a person with a disability because they're running behind or because they don't want to stop for whatever reason, then yes, that is a violation of the person's right to transportation. Again, it's the ADA is intended to ensure equal access to transportation, and passing by a person with a disability is denying that equal access. Having said that, though, if the lift is inoperable or if another accessibility feature is inoperable, then something does come into play for fixed route transportation where you do have the opportunity to say, I'm sorry, the lift isn't operable, we can't board you onto this particular vehicle, and then the transit agency has the requirement of getting another vehicle there within 30 minutes. It's called we call it the 30-minute rule. And so if the next bus is scheduled to come within that 30 minutes, then that satisfies the rule. And what we suggest is that the driver should just pull over and say, I'm sorry, my lift isn't working. The next bus is scheduled to be here within 30 minutes. If you know the time, that's even better. And then you're compliant with the ADA at that point. If the next bus is going to be longer than 30 minutes, then the transit agency does have the requirement to have some other form of transportation available to the person with a disability within 30 minutes, whether that be a street supervisor who is able to make the trip, or a paratransit vehicle if that's the case, or whatever the case may be. There does, if the next scheduled vehicle is not within 30 minutes, there does have to be a special accommodation made for that person to get them to their destination. But it is not a violation of the ADA to simply pull over and say, I'm sorry, my lift isn't working, and the next bus will be here within 30 minutes.
All right. So is a bus operator required to leave their seat to assist a passenger with a disability, so like pushing the mobility device into the bus or the van?
Well, the short answer is yes, absolutely. And this occurs in, or this appears in Section 37.165 of the regulations. It's actually very clear when it is necessary. The operator is required to assist with any accessibility features on the vehicle, including securement systems, ramps, lifts, anything like that. And if that does make it necessary for the person to leave their seat, then they have to do so. What we typically tell people is that assistance should be provided from the curb onto the vehicle and from the vehicle onto the curb at the destination. And so this may not always be required, obviously, but if there is a situation in which a person does need assistance because of their disability from the curb onto the bus or from the bus onto the curb, then it does have to be required or does have to be provided by the operator. All right, so the next question I'm going to present to Donna, and that is every bus system required to investigate, resolve, and document all ADA complaints?
And the answer is yes. The regs are very specific about this. I would also say that if any kind of action is taken to investigate your system because complaints have been made at the federal level by customers, one of the things they're certainly going to look at is how did you handle those complaints at the local level. So yes, absolutely, the agencies must provide a response to a complaint within 30 days, and then they need to address and resolve the issue. So it's not just a thank you for letting us know about this, we'll look into it. You are required to address and resolve the issue. And then you should retain all detailed documentation for 1 year and then save a summary of all ADA complaints and how they were handled for 5 years.
All right, great. Next question. Can passengers with disabilities demand to use the lap and shoulder harness but refuse to allow the mobility device to be secured when the transit system has no securement policy?
Well, this is kind of a combination of two questions that we've answered already, and that is that passengers can certainly request to use whatever kind of accessibility or securement equipment that's available. So if they want to use a seat belt, they can certainly request that they use a seat belt. Now, whether or not the securement policy kicks in depends on what your policy says. So if you have a policy that says all mobility devices must be secured, then you can say, yes, you can use the seat belt, and our policy requires that we secure your mobility device as well, and you can proceed to do that. So you can't, they don't have the right to decline securement and say, I want the seat belt, if you have a securement policy that says all mobility devices will be secured. So it's kind of a combination of those two answers above.
All right, great. The next question is a true or false question. The current definition of common wheelchair is a device that has a 48-inch by 30-inch footprint or a 600-pound weight limit. Is that true or false?
Well, that's false. This is one that we still keep talking about, but when the amendments were changed in 2000, when the ADA was amended and the new regulations came out in March of 2011, they did away with that definition of a common wheelchair. So that definition that Christy just read out is no longer there. And what the ADA says now is that if your equipment, so your lift or your ramp, if it will board that person and their wheelchair together, and if your vehicle can safely accommodate an individual, so they can turn past the fare box, they can get down the aisle, they can get into the spot for chairs, or if you're loading at the back of the bus, can they get from that loading area to the securement location? So if it fits, then they ride. And then the other piece to that is that it shouldn't trigger any legitimate safety concerns. So if the wheelchair is, they may be able to get on the bus, but it's going to block the aisle, then that would be a legitimate safety concern. The common wheelchair language just simply isn't there anymore.
All right, great. And so to sort of conclude our presentation today, I want to ask you to ask yourself a couple of questions. first, think about what your system does in order to review the ADA standards, to ensure compliance with the ADA. Are you reviewing your system on a regular basis? Annually would be a good sort of standard to use to review your policies and procedures. As Donna mentioned earlier in our questions, there is no requirement to provide anything annually. I talked about the training to proficiency. There's no specific requirement to do that annually, but it is a suggestion that we make to look at your system, and annual is a good sort of standard to use to get to that. What are the current ADA standards? Has anything changed? Is there any guidance? There may not have been an official change in the regulation, but there very well may have been guidance provided by the Federal Transit Administration that would either clarify some point in the ADA and or provide best practices that may be helpful in implementing the ADA. So certainly, ask yourself, do you review your system? If not, is it something that you can add to what you do to ensure that you are meeting the ADA standards? And then secondly, do you know where to find resources? Do you know what to do to find the answer if you have an ADA question? I'm going to go through a few slides here upcoming and talk to you about some of the resources that are available. But I certainly suggest that you keep us in mind as well. If you have some questions, we're always happy to take those and to help out. And so you'll find our contact information at the end of the presentation. But that's certainly a good place to start with resources. But also keep in mind your peers, other transit agencies, other organizations. There are several training and technical assistance centers that provide national assistance that you could possibly go to for assistance as well. So I'll give you some specifics, some specific places that you might check into for resources, but ask yourself, do you know where to go to find the answers if you have questions? So first, we always suggest, if there are ADA questions, go straight to the ADA, and you can find them. It's not incredibly entertaining reading generally, but it is incredibly informative, and it often will answer the questions that you have. And you can find this on the FTA website, and you'll see that we've provided a link there. You can also just Google FTA and Americans with Disabilities Act, and you'll find information that way as well. And this is going to be on any requirement with regard to providing transportation in the ADA that you'll be able to find there. And the FTA also provides a lot of guidance. So outside of the actual written regulations, you can find on FTA's website some additional guidance that might be helpful in answering the question that you have. Another good resource, the FTA does provide frequently asked questions on transit in the ADA. I've actually gone to this site several times to provide documentation to people's questions when they've contacted us. The website is there. Again, I'm fairly certain you can find this quickly by Googling frequently asked questions in the FTA or transit in the ADA and the FTA, but the website directly to that resource is there. That's a great place to start to look. And then finally, I really love the topic guides that were developed not too long ago, I want to say maybe a few years ago, from the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund. It was a project that was funded by the FTA and the DOT, and it talks very specifically about the ADA regulations with regard to transportation. A few of them are paratransit specific, so if you're providing fixed route and paratransit service, then those would be really helpful. But the others are fixed route specific and provide some additional information that would be helpful for demand response and flex route as well. So there are 7 of them. They are available for download for free from the web site that's listed there. So I highly encourage that you check that out as well. And then, as I mentioned, we do at East Trussell's Project Action answer questions, and we have lots of resources available on our website, which is projectaction.org. We have a resource library with things like frequently asked questions on service animals and other resources that might be helpful. Another thing that you'll find on our website, we have webinars that we present that we host, and we provide the archived versions of those also on the website. And so you can sort of scroll through the topics and see if there's anything that might be of interest to you, and those are made available for free as well. So, so please do keep us in mind if you have future questions. At this point, I want to turn it back over, and I think we're ready to take questions.
Great, thank you guys so much. I'll just jump right into the questions. We have a few questions about, is there a specific weight limit or something like that? What happens if the wheelchair and the wheelchair user exceed what you think the weight limit on the vehicle and the wheelchair lift is?
I'll take this one, Donna, if that's okay. Generally, as Donna had mentioned when she was talking about the elimination of the common wheelchair term in the regulations, what she was saying is if the wheelchair is able to be boarded onto the bus via the lift, then that person should be transported. The FTA is not expecting that a transit agency will transport a person in their wheelchair that weighs 800 pounds together when their lift is only rated to transport or to lift a maximum of 600 pounds. They're not making that expectation, but they are expecting that if it's possible that the transit agency would provide transportation. And so the best practice that we have found that agencies are using, especially if you're talking fixed route, but certainly with a demand response or paratransit as well, is if it's possible, then do it. And so the best way to figure out if it's possible is to try. You know, what you don't want to do, especially in fixed route, is to start asking a bunch of questions about the weight and trying to figure out whether or not it's going to work. It's just faster to attempt it and see what happens. Now, if you're talking demand response and you really have some concerns prior to showing up at a pickup location, then you may make some suggestions to the passenger that you tested out prior to the trip. So it's certainly possible that you could schedule a time prior to a pickup that the person's requesting to just see if the vehicle and your lift is going to operate when you're trying to lift the person. So, so you know, just keep those things in mind. The FTA, again, not requiring you to transport every wheelchair, no matter what the weight. You know, there are certain weight ratings that the lifts are going to have, but they do expect that the agency is going to make every effort to transport persons regardless of their weight, and certainly if it's possible, then they expect it to happen.
Great, thank you. I just want to know if you did submit a question and we don't get to it today, we'll follow up with you after the webinar. So we have a couple of questions about service animals. And if someone says that an animal is a comfort animal, does that mean that they're not a service animal?
Well, I'll take the service animal question. So there is a difference between a service animal and a comfort animal. So, and there is no requirement under the ADA that you transport comfort animals. It does start to get a little uncertain when the task that the animal performs is something to help offset, let's say, anxiety. So if a person has an anxiety disorder and the way they're able to get out and about and take care of their business is if they have a service animal with them that helps them to maintain the balance that they need in order to get things done that they need to get done, then that animal is actually performing a task. But it does sound a whole lot like comfort. So there's kind of a, if everyone always used these terms exactly the way they're supposed to be used, then we could clearly say, if they say it's a comfort animal, then you don't have to take it. If they say it's a comfort animal and you want to say, so what kind of task does it perform, just to see what they're going to say about it, you can certainly do that. What we generally tell people is that you don't want your operator spending an inordinate amount of time on the side of the road trying to make this determination, because they have schedules to keep. So what you want to do is give it kind of a quick 1-2 questions and then make a quick decision about transport. And if that animal's under control and there's some doubt in your mind about whether it is a pet or a service animal, then we say just go ahead and transport them as long as the animal's under control. But if it gets down to something that you have to investigate at a deeper level, so maybe management's going to come in and do some real consideration about a particular passenger with their particular animal, then you can start to get down to the details about the animal and what kind of task it actually provides.
Great. And 2 more questions about service animals. One is, do service dogs need to be on a leash when on the bus? And then the other one is, can an individual have 2 service animals?
The question about a leash, the requirement is that they be under the control of the handler. So, if they can give that kind of control without, or maintain that kind of control without a leash, there's nothing in the ADA that in the definition of a service animal under the ADA that says the animal has to be on a leash. It says they have to be under control. And under control can also apply to overly friendly behavior. When we talk about an animal not being under control, we often think about it, growling or snapping or lunging at people, something that's kind of scary, but can also be something that's too friendly. So, for instance, if my service dog was out of control, she'd be out of control because she would be trying to get everybody on the bus to pet her. So she'd be going around, rolling over at people's feet, that kind of stuff. But that's also out of control. So if the animal is not under control, you don't have to transport them. You can say, I'm willing to take you, but I won't take your service animal until, you can correct this kind of behavior. And then the second question had to do with 2 animals, and the answer to that is yes. Again, the ADA is silent about how many service animals a person can have. However, if they have 2 or more service animals, you can ask what task does it perform for every animal, and see what kind of answers you get. There might reasonably be a reason out there why someone would need 2 service animals. So let's say one animal was there to help provide balance, and that might be a big dog, and they might have some kind of harness on them with a broad handle, something that the person can lean against to help with balance. And they may also have a smaller dog that is a seizure alert animal, or an animal that reminds them to take medication at a certain time, that sort of thing. So there might be animals trained to do different things, and both would be considered service or tasks for individuals with a disability. So there is no limitation on the number of animals, but you can ask the same 2 questions about all of them.
Great. All right, switching gears here a little bit. Are transit providers required to offer scheduling for a ride 14 days in advance?
I'll take this. It really depends. The advance notice really depends on the type of transportation that's being provided or the mode. So I'll start with the most restrictive, which is ADA complimentary paratransit. For those of you on the line that may provide that service, there is a requirement that next day service be provided for paratransit. So there is a requirement that you take reservations the day before service is being provided, even if your office is not open on that day. And where this usually comes into play is Monday service and scheduling a ride on Sunday. And so some offices are closed on Sunday, but there is still the expectation by the ADA that for ADA complementary paratransit services, a person would have the ability to schedule a ride for Monday on Sunday. And so it's perfectly acceptable if that's done via voicemail or some sort of method like that where it's not necessarily a live person answering the phone and scheduling a trip. So that's perfectly fine, but they do expect that passengers have the ability to in some way schedule a ride for Monday on Sunday. And again, that's good for every day of the week. They just need to be able to schedule the day before. They can schedule in more advance than that, but that is the minimum requirement under the ADA. For other services, for demand response services specifically, the requirement is just that there's no discrimination. And so, if you're requiring people without disabilities to give you 3 days notice, then you need to require people with disabilities to give you 3 days notice and not 10 days notice. And so there needs to be a way in which it's not discriminatory to people with disabilities. And so you need to look at your policy and what your policy is for everyone, and then base obviously the same have the same policy for people with disabilities. And so it's really a mode of transportation type of difference in answer there, and I hope that at least addressed what the questioner was asking.
Well, and this is Donna. I would just add to that. So if the question was, are you required to schedule a trip 14 days out? So if a person wants to schedule 14 days out, are you required to do that? You're not. It's whatever your policy says. So for instance, in Arlington, Virginia, their policy is to schedule a trip 7 days out. So they will do the next day reservations, obviously, but they'll allow you to schedule a trip up to 7 days out. So a person wanting to schedule 14 days out couldn't do it with that particular system. So you can set a policy about that.
Thank you, Donna.
Great, thank you. Quick question regarding commuter service. Do stops also have to be announced on a commuter service route?
That's not a question that we get very often. Commuter service is its own special bear, so to speak. The ADA complementary paratransit requirements are different for commuter service as it is for fixed route service. Just about everything is different. I don't know that either of us can answer the question for sure. Although I will say that every commuter service I have ever been on does require or does announce the stops, but I don't know for sure whether or not it's required by the ADA. That may be something we may have to find out.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but we're happy to look it up and provide the answer back to Liz and Jess at RTAP after the session's over.
Great. Here's probably another question you don't often get, but can you guys speak to what the FTA is required to do in terms of oversight for state DOTs who are providing ADA monitoring and oversight for their subgrantees? So what is the state required to provide to the FTA, and the FTA is required to do for the states in terms of that?
Based on the ADA, there's not necessarily any reporting requirements for the states to give to the FTA. That doesn't mean that there aren't reporting requirements, but based on the ADA, there aren't. In my experience from working in transit, it varies a lot by state in what you're required to report as a transit agency. And I don't, obviously the reporting by the state to the FTA is going to be done through the National Transit Database, the NTD. And so, I think that's probably the best place to look as far as reporting requirements for states to the FTA. But again, just to get back to very specifically the ADA, There's nothing stated in there that says what reporting requirements are.
Okay. So in terms of riders who may not be able to physically ride by themselves, can a provider either refuse a ride if that person looks like they're not physically capable of taking care of him or herself, or can they require an escort for the rider?
Well, I'll take this one. So,
Sure.
Yes, you need to be careful about considering that they may just look like they can't travel by themselves. So you want to be sure that there's a problem there, something that can be documented. But if a person who's riding a transit vehicle is going to need greater assistance from the operator than the ADA requires, and the ADA only requires operators to provide assistance specific to the trip. So if a person needs help finding a seat, putting on a seat belt, knowing when to get off, having the ramp lowered or the bus to kneel for them to get on, assistance and with their wheelchair while they're getting on the bus, those kinds of things are specific to the transit trip. But if a person requires assistance, it goes beyond transit specifically. So if a person needs help with medication, if a person needs some kind of assistance once they get off the bus, so the bus has reached its destination point and that person can't be left alone maybe, or if that person needs assistance getting from the bus stop to their final destination point, whatever the case may be, if that kind of assistance goes above and beyond the nature of the job, which is to provide transportation. So when that's the case, and when it's clearly the case, then what the transit agency can do is to say, you know, I can't continue to take this person if this is the type of assistance that they need, but if you want this person to travel with, this person wants to travel with a PCA, a personal care attendant, then they can do that and the PCA gets to ride for free. And then the PCA is there to provide that above and beyond type of assistance. But again, I want to be real clear that that decision needs to be based on actual happenings, not a person's perception of a person's independent travel. So just for example, one of the things that we hear about often enough is that some agencies will refuse to transport a person who is both deaf and blind, because they're thinking, I don't know how this person can travel independently, when in fact a lot of people who have dual disabilities travel quite independently. And so you can't base it on your perception of what may happen. It has to be real life, something that's occurred that you would base that decision on.
Okay, and I just want to mention that Donna and Christy have graciously agreed to answer questions until about 3:45, so we'll be taking a few more questions. Can one of you speak to the debate between door-to-door or curb-to-curb?
I'm happy to do that one too. I just did a training where we talked about this quite a lot. From the standpoint of the Americans with Disabilities Act and from the FTA's guidance on it, there really is no debate. So the paratransit is as an origin to destination trip. And you can set as your policy that typically means curb to curb, and that's fine. You can set that as a policy. But if you have customers who need that additional assistance from the door to the vehicle and from the vehicle back to the door, and that's what they need in order to complete their trip, then that should be provided as well. So you can have a curb-to-curb policy, but if you have someone who needs that extra assistance to make their trip, that's considered origin to destination by the Federal Transit Administration. And the exceptions to that would be if doing so would cause some safety issue. So maintaining line of sight of the vehicle is a big concern there. So if you are having to assist someone to the point that you can no longer be in the line of sight with your vehicle, which can create its own safety issues, then you may have a reason not to provide that additional bit of assistance under those circumstances. Or if door-to-door means that you have to back your vehicle down an alley where you're not quite sure if you have the right kind of clearance, that sort of thing, that might be a safety reason not to do the complete origin to destination trip. But as long as those sorts of things are not in the equation, on a case-by-case basis, if a person needs that additional assistance, then it should be provided. And that does not, though, mean that you have to go through the door. So if a person is going to, let's say, a doctor's office, and you get them to the door of the clinic, the operator is not required to provide any additional assistance for them to actually find the exact office that they're going to, or any, take their groceries inside their house, or any of those kinds of additional assistance. But to the door and back to the vehicle is considered to be part of that origin to destination for the trip.
Great.
Did I leave anything out, Christy?
I don't think so. That sounded very comprehensive.
Okay.
We have a couple of questions about what happens if you don't follow ADA regulations. Is there some kind of a fine assessed, and who gets that?
I'll take this one, and then obviously if you have anything to add, Donna. Generally, what happens is that maybe nothing will happen. First of all, if no action is taken by riders to make any complaints or to notify anyone that issues are occurring, it's possible that there's no repercussions. Although the FTA does do some ADA compliance reviews, it obviously is not able to review every single system every year, not even close to it. So, and then there are other ways in which agencies are reviewed, triennial reviews, which is every 3 years and things like that. But that's not a comprehensive ADA review necessarily. And so, so it's possible that there could be many, many years where nothing is going to happen. However, if somebody has a complaint, what we always suggest that they do is, if they call us, is that they complain directly to the transit agency. And so, so that's going to be sort of your first line of information that there's something going on that you might need to address. If they don't get satisfaction that way, they might complain to city council, if you're governed by the city council or a board of directors or the county, or whatever the case may be. So you may get some feedback in that way to let you know that something needs to be addressed. If that doesn't happen, the FTA does take complaints, and they take information. Obviously, things need to be documented, and they need to research those types of things. If the ADA does if the FTA does determine that there's some sort of ADA violation, what they will do is work with the agency to rectify the violation. So to make sure that policies and procedures are in place that would keep that violation from continuing, so that it would fix that problem. And so there's not a fine necessarily from the FTA. It's just a fix the problem in order to keep getting funding from us is how that works. So, so that might happen. Having said all that, though, anyone can sue civilly anyone for anything. And so what often happens, well, not often, what sometimes happens is that a person might sue the transit agency for violation of the ADA. And of course, Donna and I, not being lawyers, can't speak to what would happen as far as liability or who would be responsible or what fines there might be, but it does sometimes happen that there are lawsuits brought against agencies for ADA violations, and sometimes there are monetary compensation requirements as a part of the settlement of the lawsuit. And so it really depends on sort of who's complaining, how they complain, whether or not a lawsuit is brought, things like that, as far as the steps that would need to be taken to fix the problem, and whether or not there is any monetary fine for the ADA violation itself.
That's pretty thorough, Christy. I would only add one other thing, and that is that if the FTA gets complaints and they're reviewing the situation and they think that their intervention, or maybe they've tried some intervention with this agency, and that doesn't seem to be fixing the issue, the next step up is that they partner with the Department of Justice, who is the legal arm for the federal government, and the DOJ will bring a case against that transit agency, and that ends in a formal consent decree where certain things must be met in a certain time period, that sort of thing, and then they monitor the progress of whether those the things they've specified are being met. So that is another level that can be taken at the federal level.
Great. Can an operator deny a trip if the mobility device is unclean or unhealthy, such as the driver thinks that there might be a biohazard issue?
I'll answer this one. So this starts to get into the direct threat area. So if you think that there is a biohazard, and again, you need to be sure that there is. So you need to be confident enough when you make that call that should it be investigated, that it turns out to be true. So if there's anything that generally comes down to the presence of bodily fluids, then that could be considered a direct threat with the health and safety of other people on the vehicle, including the driver. And so that would be a reason not to transport someone. The issue of cleanliness will go back to whether or not you have a policy about hygiene on your bus and how you implement that policy about hygiene. So there are some places that have a policy that requires a certain level of hygiene. I'm never quite sure how this gets implemented fairly because it's a little subjective. It's somebody's call. You know, there's not a meter that, you know, you can have go off at a certain level of lack of hygiene. So I don't know how it's consistently applied. But if you have one and you're consistently applying it to people who are without disabilities and people with disabilities, or people with disabilities across the board, whether they use a wheelchair or not, then you can certainly implement your own hygiene policy. But in terms of what the ADA actually addresses, it has to reach the direct threat level, which would be that biohazard piece.
Okay, so we'll go with one more question for you guys, and then Liz will wrap up the webinar. I just want to mention that the presentation and the slides will be available on our website afterwards, and we'll be in touch with everybody, so you don't have to worry about that. So the final question, is the bus operator required to help a person with disabilities with their items, for example, bags of groceries?
I'll take this one. The short answer to that is no. You can require that a person be responsible for any and all items that they bring onto the vehicle. The ADA does not specify any requirement of an operator in helping with bags or you know, any other thing that may be considered an item that people are bringing onto the bus. You know, as we mentioned earlier, the requirement is to help the passenger board and or alight the vehicle, you know, based on you know, any assistance that they may need with accessibility equipment, but there is no additional requirement to help with items. Having said that, there are a lot of transit agencies that have policies that say a driver will assist with a certain number of bags and or a certain weight. You know, so for example, there may be a policy that says that the operator will assist with up to 2 bags and up to 10 pounds each bag or something like that. And obviously this is to provide assistance when needed, but also to protect the driver from requests like transporting televisions and things like that, which, believe it or not, that those have been requested of operators. So you probably would believe it, but so you can have that type of policy. What you want to ensure, though, is that your policy doesn't discriminate against people with disabilities. So if you have a policy that you're going to help people with 2 bags or 5 bags or a weight limit or whatever the case may be, that it be the same policy for people with disabilities as it is for people without disabilities. And so you can have a local policy that allows the driver to do that, but by ADA it's not required.
Great, thank you, Christy. So just so everybody knows, we will be putting together a Q&A sheet with all of the questions, including ones that weren't answered, so don't worry if your question wasn't answered. And I'm going to hand it over to Liz to wrap it up.
Great, thanks, Jess. And I want to thank Donna Smith and Christy McLaughlin again for a great presentation today, and for all the great work that they do at Easter Seals Project Action. We'd also like to thank everyone here for joining us. We hope it's been helpful. I know I learned some things, and I also wanted to mention that we at National RTAP came out with an ADA toolkit earlier this year, and it's under the Toolkits tab of our website at nationalrtap.org, and it lists all the requirements for transit providers under the ADA, and it breaks it out by the service type, so fixed route, demand response, et cetera. And there's a lot of links and resources, so that's another place to look for ADA requirement issues and to learn more. We look forward to seeing everyone at our next 101 webinar in the new year, tentatively on FTA bus safety program. And like Jess said, we'll be posting a recording of this webinar on our website soon. We will be in touch, and we'll be sending out a survey too. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day, and happy holidays, everyone. Thank you.